Good.
All right, welcome to Season 3, Episode 1 of Challenges in the Streets. Today we're going to be talking about water supply operations, specifically relay pumping considerations. But before we begin, I would like to take a moment to recognize the tragic loss to the Baltimore City and the Baltimore City Fire Department, if we could. All right, thank you. Just a quick reminder, if you're a certified chief officer, please sign in with your fire service ID now and then at the end of the show, and Chief Thomas will take care of what he does to get you credit, COPDI credit. So today I would like to welcome Captain Troy Lipp, Station 31 on the A shift, and Battalion Chief Davis, Battalion 1 on the A shift, to talk about the water supply. Guys?
All right, thanks. I want to get started with just a few things. If you think about your time, so this really is geared right to our company officers and really in this case, all of our engine drivers, right? So think about your time over learning to drive or being a company officer or running fires that may have involved long hose lays. There always has been some mystique to, like, hey, how far apart can my engines be and still flow a reasonable amount of water? And by the way, what is that reasonable amount of water? So back in late fall, in the month of November, Captain Troy Lipp and some other folks worked to test out some of the notions about this to try to make some of that mystique go away as it relates to our fire equipment, our engines, our hose, our appliances. With the notion of what can we do, how far can we be apart, what do we got to do to meet MCFRS's critical fire flow rate of 500 gallon a minute as identified in the IRP. So Captain Lipp did some really good work planning this out, laying it out, I'll say using the scientific method. I was happy to be part of the work that he did, and we brought him here today to talk about that. So I think this is really important information for first arriving company officers who are making a decision about what kind of hose lay to do on a long lay. I think it's also important for our engine drivers out there who may be forced into a relay scenario. What does that mean? And from our command officers out there, like, hey, you got 3,000 foot lay back to this house that's on fire, back this single lane or a common use driveway. What are some choices? And you know what? You're going to find out that you might be able to accomplish and meet our critical fire flow need with a little bit different approach than what we would have thought about before. So that's all I got to say. I may interject some other stuff as we go along. What I really want is Captain Lipp to talk about the what, why, and the outcome of the project that he worked on. Captain Lipp.
Thanks, Chief. So to start out, I want to start just by acknowledging the folks involved here. Captain Dominic Coletti had a big role in sort of conceptualizing this, coming up with our goals and talking through some of the scenarios and our intent in this. Chief Davis lent us his expertise as well as some of his specialized equipment, which was invaluable. And we had folks from stations 10, 14, and 31 on the C shift that were all involved on a rather brisk November day with laying out a bunch of hose and flowing some water and entertaining my whims as far as accomplishing all this. So why did we undertake this? Well, we have these long-held beliefs about our ability to pump water over long distances, but we've never really validated it. And there's some long-held beliefs by the organization about how often we have to interject a relay pumper if we're pumping over a certain distance. And I think as I anecdotally talk to folks around the organization, they say every 1,000 feet we need a fire truck. And to me, it seemed like that was excessive. And it often would interfere in our ability to effectively and quickly build a water supply for a fireground operation, because we got hung up in this expectation of we needed X number of fire trucks if we're going to pump that long. So I wanted to make sure that what we were doing made sense. Notionally, it wasn't making sense to me based on calculations I had done. I wanted to look at the formulas that we use for our calculations and validate them. MCFRS, if you look at our 4-inch LDH, we calculate our friction loss at, for every 100-foot section, Q squared divided by 5 is the formula that we've always used. Well, is that a valid formula, and does it actually bear out in real-world practice? And we wanted to look at realistically how often we need to insert a relay pumper, and then what were the effects when we did. We wanted to take all this information as we evaluated these aspects and relate it all back to what we're doing in our incident response policy in the water supply section, as well as looking at the curriculum that we're teaching in the pumps and hydraulics curriculum, in our apparatus specifications and our hose and equipment inventories, and just make sure that the stuff that we were doing makes sense and passes muster in the real world. So that's sort of where we started. We scoured the county, and I came up with this as our test site. This is actually on the grounds of the Dickerson power plant that's owned by Genon and no longer operational, so they don't have a lot of activity going on there. It's actually currently up for sale if you're interested in buying a piece of land in Montgomery County. And what it gave us was, it gave us a nice sized pond there on the lower left of the screen. It gave us a big parking lot where we could lay out a whole bunch of hose, and we could do it without impacting day-to-day life elsewhere in the county. So this was a good site for us. So there was a couple of scenarios that we did. This is probably the easiest and most straightforward scenario, which was pumping through 1,800 feet of 4-inch hose. So that's all of the supply line on the new Pierce inventory. And we operated from draft. We operated from draft with 2 hard sleeves just to make sure that we had adequate hard sleeve capacity, that wasn't hampering our flow capacity. We had one of the Pierce engine companies was our draft supply engine, and then we laid out 1,800 feet of hose, pumped it down to the attack engine there, so it went up the hill, back down, and the attack engine then pumped it off to a thing called a hose monster. We'll talk about that in just a quick second. Operationally, what had been decided by the apparatus and fleet folks in the organization and the ops representatives was that we should not be comfortable pumping a 4-inch supply line at anything higher than 250 psi. We arrived at that number because we service test the 4-inch hose at 300 psi, and the chiefs felt that we needed to leave a bit of a margin of error so that we're not pushing the hose right to its limit. So the number of 250 psi was what was set as our maximum supply pressure from that draft engine pumping into this supply line. So it's important for me to mention here real quick before we go on to this next slide is that the 250 psi is what's determining how much water comes out the other end of the hose. So it doesn't matter whether we're putting the 250 psi in from a pond or from a hydrant or from a tanker pumping a clappered Siamese. What we're looking at is that if we know that the maximum in is 250 psi, what does that translate to as far as GPM out the other end of the hose over what we consider to be long distances. So we use this thing called a hose monster. This is a piece of equipment that Chief Davis owns. He brought it to the site, and what it does is it just gives us a quick and easy discharge that redirects the water flow from the discharge, dissipates that force of water coming out, and it gives the measurement of the discharge pressure just like a pitot gauge would, and from that discharge pressure you can use charts or formulas to calculate what the actual flow is that's coming out the end of the hose. So, so this first scenario, we had this maximum 250 psi pump pressure because it's achievable at draft without overworking the pump. It's also achievable with a tanker pumping off, and it's certainly easily achievable if you're operating from a hydrant. It leaves a margin of safety, and currently the high flow discharges on some of the engines have a hard set relief valve on those LDH or the high flow discharges that's set at 200 psi, and we're investigating modifying that so that they will all be excuse me, hard set at 250 psi so that across the organization it'll be standardized. The Pierce engines, of course, the discharge pressure relief on those large diameter discharges are maintained by the pressure governor on the apparatus. One really important point that we want to make sure everybody's aware of is that MCFRS engines all are using our same specification 4-inch large diameter supply hose that has a working service pressure of 300 psi. But if you have mutual aid companies involved in the supply line or on the fire ground that may have hose on the street, we need to be very cautious because they could be carrying the old rubber jacketed hose that had a maximum service pressure of 200 psi, and so we would have to adjust downward. We wouldn't get the flows that we were trying to achieve, but we also wouldn't hurt anybody by rupturing a supply line hose. In the end, what we went for was a scenario that gave us zero net head pressure, so the elevation wasn't a factor. So we pumped up the hill. It came back down to the same elevation as the draft engine, so the net was a zero. But if you were in a scenario where you were pumping uphill, you're going to have a little bit less flow available because you're now pumping against some head pressure, and that's eating up a little bit of that 250 psi depending on how big a hill. So just be aware of that. On the receiving, that attack engine, we took his pressure, his intake pressure down to zero because we wanted to get the maximum water out of the supply line. So he took the intake pressure down to zero, which was established by the supply line going soft at the intake and also the pump nearing cavitation. You could look at the pump discharge pressure gauge and you start to see it bouncing because of the cavitation effect. We knew that we were right at the limit. We wanted to make use of every gallon that was available in the supply line. And one of the really important things that came out of this was that we validated that our theoretical calculated flows that are based off of our standard MCFRS friction loss formula, they actually work. And so if you remember from your pumps and hydraulics, and every engine driver is aware, every 100-foot section of 4-inch hose, we calculate the friction loss as Q squared divided by 5. What I was interested in here was not what's my friction loss. I was actually interested in my flow. So I had to just solve this formula, a little bit of algebra, and flip it around and solve for Q. And so that means that the friction loss, the total amount of friction loss divided by the number of sections times 5, and the square root of that is going to give you the flow. Not everybody cares about that, but if you do, that's how we arrive at it. And so, for example, if we know that we're not going to pump the line at any more than 250 psi, And in the scenario that we're talking about here, we have 18 100-foot sections. Then we can calculate out Q, and it comes out to Q being 8.33. So theoretically, based on the formula, we're expecting 1,800 feet of supply line to deliver 833 gallons per minute to the fire ground. So the question is, did that play out in our actual real-world application? We laid out 1,800 feet of hose. We didn't have a relay pumper in the middle. We put 250 PSI in one end, and out the other end came 843 gallons per minute. So that is a fantastic flow for just about any fire ground you're on in Montgomery County. We know that in our IRP, our critical flow rate that we're trying to achieve is 500 gallons per minute. So 843 gallons per minute more than meets that. That leaves us a lot of extra fluff, and certainly can cover the vast majority of the fire grounds that we're up against. So that was...
I think I'd like to interject something.
Sure.
So, and you mentioned it, but I think it's important to highlight, right, that, so what was the attack engine's intake pressure?
The attack engine's intake pressure was essentially 0.
Right, so that's really important, right? So for you engine drivers out there, I know the experienced ones understand, like, hey, I'm willing to drop my pressure to 0 if I need to, right? I'm just gonna have to be really careful about that. For the new folks that are going by like, hey, this is what the book says and blah, 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 in order to get that flow, you had to be willing to take your intake to 0, right? And so that means you got to monitor that. Not 20 on the intake, not 50 relay pressure on the intake, none of that, right? Long hose lay, there's some trade-offs. A long hose lay is I got to be able to negotiate my intake pressure, right? So think about, hey, you got so much money, you're trying to buy something, you're negotiating things to get a better price. The better price is more flow. I'm negotiating my intake pressure. And as that wagon driver, yeah, you got to pay more attention to what you're doing, right? But I think that's important. All of these tests that Captain Lip did, all those were taken to, hey, use every drop of water that could get to that attack pumper. So very important. He explained it. I wanted to make sure everybody's good on that, right?
Right, and back in the day when I was learning to drive an engine, the guys that were teaching me were saying that 20 PSI was so that we're not messing up WSSC's water mains, right? Because if you took a water main to 0, then you run the risk of creating a siphon on some business on the same water main, or potentially collapsing the water main because it's been weakened for years and years of service and things like that. So that's how it was explained to me when I was learning to drive a wagon, is 20 was the hard number, so you didn't damage the water main, and that was a solid practice. But when you're trying to achieve as much flow as possible, then you can absolutely safely take it down to 0. You just have to be a little bit more attentive to your water supply, because anything on the upstream side that's coming into you could cause you to cavitate. So you want to make sure that you're prepared for that. So we operated the 1,800 feet, and we were pleased to get 843 gallons per minute out of it. That was fantastic. So then the next thing we did, which was really sort of where Captain Coletti and I got talking, was what about if you did basically a mile of hose? Because I knew the value of GPM that I thought we should be able to achieve, and it was actually pretty close to our critical flow value that we want on a fire ground. So I'm thinking, if you can do that through a mile of hose, that's pretty significant. So we laid it out, mile of hose up in that parking lot, zigzagging back and forth. The guys from 10 and 14 put all their hose on the street. So that's 3 Pierce engine hose beds full of hose, 5,400 feet, which is a little bit more than a mile, and there is no relay pumper in the middle of this. Same exact thing. I did the calculation. The calculation told me that I should expect 477 gallons per minute, and we got 471 gallons per minute. That's pretty close to 500 gallons per minute, and that's through 1 mile of hose, a little bit more than 1 mile of hose. We were able to get 471 gallons per minute out the other end from just one engine pumping 250 psi in the front of the hose. That's pretty significant. We did it again, and this time we just put one relay engine in the middle and then saw what the effect was on the GPM out the other end. So there are a couple of different ways that we're going to talk about how we're going to put the relay pumper in the middle of the supply line. I'm calling this our heavy water relay hookup, and that is utilizing a gated Y and a clappered Siamese to take the water from the supply line coming in, send it through the relay pumper, and then boost the pressure to the fire ground, because this gave us our greatest flow. However, if for some reason you didn't have that, or it wasn't set up, or however you're trying to recover and you need to, you can use a HUMAT valve. We're going to talk about both of those. So this is the heavy water relay hookup. So the water supply coming in from whatever the source, whether it's a pond, a hydrant, or a tanker, is coming in from the right-hand side of the slide. We drop that jumbo gated, the 4-inch gated Y down on the ground. That little short shot of blue hose that goes across to the clappered Siamese, it's one that we had made up years ago when I was doing some other tanker testing. It actually wouldn't be a bad thing for all the engines to have, because it is a nice little functional hose for a couple different things on fire grounds. But so that's the hose that is the direct through from the supply to the attack engine at whatever pressure was coming into the hose. So, you know, you had the mile of hose on the ground, 250 psi. It's passed straight through to the clappered Siamese going into the attack engine off the left side of the screen there. But then we want to insert our relay engine, so we use our large intake sleeve, and we hook into the other side of that gated Y, and then just like you would if you were pumping a HUMAT valve, you boost the pressure in the other side of that clappered Siamese. That's going to take over, and you're going to boost the pressure. We did this at the 2,700 foot mark. So one relay engine in the middle, right at 2,700 feet, using that heavy water relay hookup. And we boosted from our 471 gallons, we went up to 672 gallons. So we gained 200 gallons per minute just by putting one engine in the middle of a mile of hose. That was pretty significant. The other thing that's a little bit significant here is that if you ran that calculation using the Q squared formula and solve for your gallons, you would come up with 680 gallons per minute. So once again, validated our friction loss formula. Here's the HUMAT version. So this one might surprise people because we don't typically think of the HUMAT being used as a relay valve. But essentially what we're doing is we're bringing in that supply hose that's coming in from the right side of the slide there, and that is our hydrant. Even though the hydrant might be half a mile or more down the road, that's our hydrant. So it hooks into the HUMAT just like we would hooking the HUMAT to a hydrant. You need that little adapter, the 4.5-inch adapter, to go from the 4-inch storage to the HUMAT. You plug it in the back side, and then we know, just like the HUMAT always does, it's going to immediately then send the water through the HUMAT, down through the distribution box, and directly to the attack engine. And then you just boost the pressure off of the HUMAT valve just like you would as if it was hooked directly to the hydrant. So you put your sleeve on the other end, open up the butterfly valve, hook the pressure to your high flow discharge, and send it in the other side of the distribution box, and you've then boosted the pressure. The caveat to this is that there is a pressure loss here because there is friction in that HUMAT valve. And we know that because we would normally, if we were hooking that HUMAT valve to a hydrant, we always want to dress out that hydrant first with some gate valves on the 2.5-inch butts so that we get every drop of water we can out of the hydrant. So the same thing here, we know that we're losing a little bit of flow capacity through that HUMAT valve because there is some inherent friction and flow restrictions in it. Unfortunately, because it's a HUMAT in the middle of nowhere, we can't dress out the hydrant here. So we're stuck with that. Here's the impact of it. 5,400 feet using the HUMAT valve as our relay hook in, we lost 100 gallons per minute. So it's not to say you can't use the HUMAT valve. You just have to realize you're sacrificing, in this test, it was about 15% of your available flow by choosing to use the HUMAT as opposed to using that jumbo gated Y and the clappered Siamese. So Chief Davis has a couple of slides he wants to go through, and then I think we're going to try to go out to the engine room and do it practical for you.
All right, cool. All right, thanks. So there are our test documents, right? So Captain Lip did a really good job of writing everything up. I know you can't see them here, but they're going to be on quick links. We promised to have them up by close of business this Friday. There'll be one for each one of those tests. It lays out everything, scientific method, how we went through it, all the math, right? So he was talking about doing that stuff. Hopefully, right? That's why you don't skip math class, right? In middle school, anyway. Did a good job on that. There'll be quick links under our current priority projects on the front page. They'll be up there for a while, maybe 60 days, something like that. There'll be PDF. Take a look at it. Good to go. Wanted to talk about two things prior to us going outside to the engine room. One is, so we did some tanker testing for ISO back in August, and how is this related? So this is related, in a logical question that would come up is, hey, can my tanker pump 250 PSI through the high flow discharge? So we had to confirm that. So we confirmed that through fleet and through the pump testing folks, and yes, all of our tankers and 17's engine tanker, every one of them can develop 250 PSI through the large diameter hose discharge. So there should be no worry about hooking your tanker up to the double clapper Siamese at the end of 5,400 feet of hose or 1,800 feet of hose or whatever, and not being able to develop that flow. You should be able to do that. The other point, I just want to go back to make sure there's no confusion, right? On a municipal hydrant system, public water, we don't want to take that below 20 PSI without talking to somebody, right? So when we talked about the intake pressure, it was on the attack pumper. Dude, take that to whatever you want. You can negotiate that, right? You want to minimize going below the 20 in the system without talking to somebody. Upper rock fire, right? Some big fire, you're draining the system. Hey, you're talking to somebody. Incident commander says, look, we need to take this below 20. Talk to the water authority. Let it happen. All right, one other thing. So part of the ISO testing, we had to show our tanker, nurse tanker, attack tanker operation, the tanker supplying the Siamese. I have a couple slides here. I want to run through, if you guys don't mind popping them up. So this was the sequence of event. So the engine arrived and laid out their supply line. Where we have differences is between our Crimsons and our Pierces do not carry the Siamese pre-connected. That is a problem for everybody running non-hydrant areas. Somebody has got to remember to do that. Hopefully you remember that. I can't promise you that that's going to happen. If you're running a Crimson, then you're laying out with the double clappered Siamese. So here's, we used Ford's wagon. They did a good job. So the engine driver pulls up. He's laying out, grabbing the HUMAT line. Oh, by the way, he is grabbing the double clapper Siamese because that is going to have to be dropped wherever water supply is eventually going to occur. We know an attack tanker is going to go with them. We know another engine's going to go with them. Somebody got to make sure that that is left at wherever they envision water supply occurring, right? That's what's left, wrapped around a pole, a tree, a mailbox, Jimmy's truck, I don't care, it's there, right? completes his lay, does his thing in terms of what's happening. Eventually, a tack tanker is going to come up in there. Now we're talking about what's happening at the end of that hose lay. Most likely what's going to happen is the second arriving tanker is going to take that supply line and support that, right? You got a fire, that dude is going to drive up and hook up to that and support that. What do they got to do? They got to take off the humat. If it's a Pierce wagon, they got to take off that humat, they got to put on that double clapper, and they got to pump that. I believe, pretty much confident on this, but you're going to have to check yourself. I believe every tanker also, every one of our tankers also carries a double clapper Siamese. So my message is, you have got to use this stuff. That has got to be left. If you're running a Crimson, pretty hard to mess that up. If you're running a Pierce, we've allowed an opportunity for error to occur, meaning that somebody is not going to lay out with that. Why do I bring it to your attention? One is we had a fire that happened. Nobody laid out the double clapper. The tanker pulls up. No double clapper got put on. It was a Pierce engine. There was a new driver on the tanker. Fortunately, the fire was not a big deal, but there was not an easy way to expand that water supply. Second is during the ISO testing, somebody asked me, do you want the double clappered Siamese on it? Obviously, just asking that question allowed me to feel that, hey, there's a little bit of, I'm not sure what's going on out there, right? Our tanker operations to meet that 500 gallon minute critical fire flow in our IRP says non-hydrant area, somebody is dropping that double clapper. So I don't care who does it, preferably it's that engine company that's laying it out. Those folks running the Pierce engines, you got to be extra good about that thing gets dropped. I think that's all I got. One other note, so the test, right, that we did, it was done from draft. That is the hardest the pumper's got to work, right? Why do we pump test it from draft? That is the most difficult. That pumper works hard to get water into it, and it also worked hard to get it out. You also note that we did it with 2 sleeves, right? So the old notion of, if I'm going to be an engine, go into a water site, try to get as much water into me. On the hydrant, heavy water heavy water hookup at a pond, you're looking to get twin drafting sleeves in there as best you can with good high flow strainers, and that's what we did with that Pierce. So 31's wagon worked really hard that day. It's clear of what their capability was. Any questions before we move outside? 2, no questions.
0.
Gotcha. All right, so that being said, we're going to take about an 8-minute break. We've got to reconfigure a few things. We're going to move out to the engine bay. Captain Lip is going to talk about and walk through a demonstration of setting up the 2 different versions of inserting a relay pumper or leaving space for that relay pumper. So that's it. You got 8 minutes to go do something, Facebook your girlfriend, smoke them if you got them, get a cup of coffee. We'll see you out in the engine bay. Setting up the relay appliances, right, for the Jumbo Y and the Siamese, double clapper Siamese, and for the Humat. So Captain Lip is going to work through that. We also had a question or two come in. We'll try to get that answered. Remember, if you have a question, fire it off in the chat. Captain Lip?
All right, thanks. So I've got my guys here. We're going to build out our water supply. This is RE17 is actually engine 731 right now. And so we just laid this yellow line into the fire ground. They're going to come in. This is the hose line that's going to the fire ground, and we need to support it. So we're going to build out by first removing the Humat and inserting the clappered Siamese, just like Chief Davis was talking about. This is our standard evolution. So we got to get rid of the Humat. We're going to insert the clappered Siamese, and then on this end, we're going to insert the gated, the 4-inch gated valve, the jumbo gate. And then between them, we're going to put one of our little short shots. You could do whatever size hose you had available. You know, this is nice because it keeps everything compact for our display case here. And so you hook these together, and then when you open, we have that gate open, and the hose hooked into our clappered Siamese. The yellow line gets charged, and the water's going to the fire ground. There's no boost in pressure yet. It's just whatever's coming down the yellow line is going on to the fire ground. Now we need to boost the pressure. So we're going to pull our sleeve, and we're going to take water from the other side of the gated valve here, the gated Y. We're going to bring water into the engine via the sleeve. Just like we normally do, right? This is water in as if we're coming in from the hydrant. And then we need to boost. So the boost is going to come out of our high flow discharge and go into the other side of the clappered Siamese. The yellow line was already flowing straight through. The red line was getting water direct. The red line is still getting water. We're just opening the supply to the relay engine. That supply to the relay engine is allowing the relay engine to boost the pressure back out from that high flow. When it gets to a higher pressure coming in the other side of that clappered Siamese, the one gate on the Siamese is going to close and the other gate is going to open, just like on any other evolution using that clappered Siamese. And now we're boosting the pressure. And just doing that through a mile of hose, we're going to go from the 471 gallons, we're going to go to 672 gallons. So 200 gallon per minute increase just by putting an engine in the middle. So we're going to break this down. We're going to go back to the red line having a Humat. We're going to get this stuff out of here, and we're going to talk about how to use the Humat as a relay engine.
I want to stop you just a minute. Just hold up, guys.
Hold for just a second.
So I think I want to talk to the command officer part about this.
He's over there.
Over here, sorry. So just think about this for a minute. We occasionally have campaign events, right? You may be there 6 hours, you may be there 12 hours, you might be there a week, and you initially started with tanker operations and you chose to build out a relay. What this arrangement allows is, hey, that engine, it's your turn to go home, send the next engine in. They can roll in, the next engine just picks right up with that, right? So while you may look at this to say, why are you doing it this way? There are some benefits to that. And this way works really well. It allows for other considerations. So from the water supply officer perspective, from our incident commanders, bigger events, this would be an important way to add and subtract engines, right? And at the end of the day, it's like, hey, we're going home. You could just leave all that stuff and that engine goes home and this hose stays there for another 5 or 6 days. Based upon the event. So I just wanted to hop in there. I thought about that because we had a off-camera discussion about the water supply officer. This would be a choice for building that out, and it is a better flow than the HUMAT valve. Back to you,
Chief,
go.
The other thing that goes sort of to one of the questions that came in, which was, did we test just inserting the engine directly into the supply line? And did we test that scenario? And the answer is we did not. And one of the reasons is that these two hook-in scenarios for our relay engine are essentially accomplishing the same purpose and intent that we use a HUMAT valve, which is that we can establish a water supply uninterrupted, then we can expand on that water supply and increase the pressure. That's why we use a HUMAT valve on a hydrant. So we can establish the flow at the hydrant pressure and then boost the flow without interrupting, without ever shutting down. On the other hand, if all you had was a long, mile-long supply line with no gates and no HUMATs and nothing in the middle, and then you decided, I need more pressure, you would have to shut off the water flow on your supply line to insert either appliances or a fire truck. That's not really an option. We want an uninterrupted flow. We do it in the city off of a hydrant. I want to be able to do it in the country down a long farm lane just the exact same way. So this allows us to do that either by inserting our heavy water relay hookup like this, which means throwing at a minimum our jumbo gated Y and our clappered Siamese with a short section between them, and then we can come back later and build out the relay pumper if we decide it's needed. But those would need to be in place, or what we're going to show you right now, let's pop these things out of here, guys. And we're going to go through the steps to hook the HUMAT in as the relay valve. So they're just pulling these things out of the way here. I'll grab the gate for you. All right, so the HUMAT was what was found when we arrived. We arrive at the HUMAT sitting in the driveway. Our line is the yellow line, and we are going to hook the HUMAT. So pause for just a second, guys. Let's hook the HUMAT onto the red line, because this is what the guys left us, right? They laid the HUMAT out at the end of the driveway. We came up the driveway. This is what we found. Now we're going to expand. We expand by taking our 4-inch Storts by 4.5-inch NST and plugging it into the steamer adapter, the female steamer, on the HUMAT, just as if we're hooking to the hydrant. That yellow line is our hydrant. Even though the hydrant's a mile down the road, that yellow line is the hydrant. This looks familiar, right? If you envision the yellow line as the hydrant, the red line going to the fire ground, it looks just like a city hookup. Now we need to expand and boost the pressure. How are we going to do that? We're going to do it the exact same way we would if it was a hydrant. We're going to bring our sleeve in. We're going to hook the sleeve to the butterfly steamer on the HUMAT. We're going to open the butterfly on the HUMAT, so now the water that's coming in the yellow hose is not only going down the red hose, but it's going to go in the white hose just like it always does off of a hydrant. And then we're going to boost the pressure and pump it in the other side of the HUMAT. It's pretty straightforward if you think of the yellow supply line just as if it were a hydrant. That's simple. That's
Probably not.
And it's really referring to the other configuration that we had and the anticipation of long lines. So multiple engine, full assignment. We have 6 engines coming. Is it incumbent upon me as a second due engine, if I'm running behind 31 and you lay out 1,800 feet of hose and I'm coming in and we have a 3,000 foot lay, 4,000 foot lay or whatever, should I stop and take the time to put these appliances in the lay? Is that kind of where is that what you're saying?
I think that's probably where we need to go.
Okay.
I mean, we haven't institutionalized this
Certainly.
yet, but I think it would make sense for us to just as a notional baseline expectation that anytime you've dumped your whole hose bed and you come up on the next guy,
Add these appliances.
that we add these appliances because it is our heavy water relay hookup. We can establish the flow and get it going, and then uninterrupted we can boost it if we need to.
So something to think about for additional engines, even the
Right.
first engine.
It obviously isn't in the IRP yet. It isn't in our pumps and hydraulics curriculum, but notionally that's what's going to allow us the uninterrupted water supply aspect versus getting all those lines hooked together a mile long, all the water's flowing, and then we go, we would really like a little bit more pressure. Now we got to shut it down.
Chief.
So I'm going to follow up on that also. I think, so a realistic item, a realistic question, right, is put it into my pumper. If you think about this, our pump, if it's a Montgomery County pumper, especially our frontline pieces, our Pierces and our Crimsons, that, hey, right, those are big pumps. Those are Hale Q-Maxes. They'll do 2250 from draft. They got a 450, 500 horsepower motor in them. Plenty of capability. What this arrangement does is gives me control outside of that pumper of my intake, right? So, and at the same point in time, I talked about I can replace that pumper if I need to, right? At the end, at the beginning, something happens. If it was a smaller capacity, if it was a mutual aid pumper that, I'm not so sure, they bring a 1250 to the game. I don't know what they're bringing, right? It may be problematic, but for us, it's not. And, right, our test showed that it met our critical fire flow, and it does give you some additional control of your intake and your discharge. And if something wacky goes on in your pumper, you still got water going straight through you for that. So I think there's a lot of value to thinking about that, using that.
And then not only limiting ourselves to rural, 270, the Beltway, the ICC,
Right.
any real place where the limited hydrants.
Unhydrated streets in 24's area and 15's area. I mean, I can't say this with certainty, but I don't think that there's much of 15's area that's more than a mile from a hydrant.
It's been a long time. I can't remember.
Maybe there is, but there would be very few areas in 15's area that more than a mile, but there are some areas that are a pretty good distance from the last hydrant. So we can establish a long supply line from that last hydrant and supply a pretty solid amount of water at the other end over a pretty substantial distance.
And you may have done this and not talked about it. When we used 3 engines to achieve our 5,400 feet, did we only put one engine in at the 2,700 foot mark, or did we do 1,800,
Right.
1,800?
We did just one in the middle to see what that effect was. Ran out of time and it was cold. It would certainly be worthwhile to...
Only assuming it would increase it with
It would.
With
It
a
would
second
increase
engine.
it. I'm not sure that it would increase it substantially. You could just do one engine at the 1,800 foot mark and have 3,600 feet of hose, and that would be another scenario. There's a bunch of different scenarios because, like I say, if everybody operated from the assumption that every time we end our hose bed, we're going to throw our gated 4-inch valve and our clappered Siamese and hook them together, and that will allow us to build out. You could choose to put 1 or 2 or 3 engines in to boost your flow down to the other end of the
Excellent
long
information.
lay. Yeah.
Chief, any additional questions come in? Okay, well, Captain, thank you very much for all of this work and coming out here and sharing this information with us. It really is something to think about, definitely. Chief, do you have anything else?
I don't. No.
Okay. So thank you for tuning in today. Just a couple more things before we wind down. Again, if you are a certified chief officer, go ahead and use your fire service ID, sign out. Chief Thomas will take care of that stuff. We do have a boss talk actually tomorrow as well. and it's really kind of rounding out our series with EMS, and it's the ALS to BLS downgrade process. How it works, why it's there, who's responsible for what. So we're going to do that tomorrow here from the Training Academy. Next month, early in the month, we hope to do a challenge in the street from ECC. We're still kind of working out the details there, but we're going to present from the ECC. And then later in the month, we're going to do two alarm fires on Garland Avenue and the fire on West Deer Park. So until then, please be safe, and thank you for tuning in.